My name is Jessica Otto, and I am the grammar specialist here at the Well-Trained Mind Academy. I've taught grammar for several years. I also teach some writing classes, and I am co-author of a couple of the grammar books that we use. So I love all things grammar. I teach all 4 levels of grammar that we offer at the Academy. We teach grammar 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we just added on a course called Practical Grammar, and that is designed for students in the rhetoric stage. So if your student maybe missed out on grammar during their middle school years, maybe they just need a little refresh of important things like comma usage, different capitalization and punctuation rules. We do a lot of work on those types of things in practical grammar, and we do a lot of practice with editing and proofreading so that students become more confident proofreading their own work. So today I am going to share with you a lesson that I would give in my Grammar 3 class. I would say this is the level where even if you as a parent have taught your student grammar for a few years, this is the level where you might need some outside help. It's where things move from the grammar stage of classical education into the logic stage, and it can become a little more challenging. So this is when we teach students about clauses. What I like to do in my classes, I like to teach a concept, and then I immediately put sentences up on the board and we practice that concept so that I can tell if the students are understanding it, and then I assign them homework from the workbook that they will do to reinforce that concept. So this is what a class would look like in Grammar 3. So we learned back in Grammar 2 about groups of words called phrases, and we defined a phrase as a group of words that has just one grammatical function, or in other words, one job to do. And we practice things like prepositional phrases, verb phrases, and we even recently learned about verbal phrases, phrases that can act like adjectives, adverbs, or nouns in a sentence. But right now we're going to move into a unit on clauses. And a clause is similar to a phrase in that it is also a group of words, but the one difference between a phrase and a clause is that a clause will have both a subject and a predicate. Now you might be tempted to think, well, isn't that the same as a sentence then? Doesn't a sentence have a subject and predicate? And you would be close. But as we learned in Grammar 1, a sentence is a group of words that not only contains a subject and predicate, it also expresses a complete thought. Not every clause does that. You could have a group of words with a subject and predicate, and it is not a complete thought. In the past, we've called that a fragment, but now we are going to learn how those fragments may be different types of clauses. So let's talk about the difference between a couple of types of clauses. If you have a group of words containing a subject and a predicate, it could be an independent or a dependent clause. So let's look at a couple of examples. This example right here, the rooster fought the hen. Rooster is the subject, fought is the verb. So we can check that box, subject and predicate, check. Does it stand alone? Is it a full, complete thought? In other words, if we were writing a paragraph and we had this group of words, could we call it a sentence? Yeah, we could. It finishes a story. So we would actually put a period at the end and we would call it an independent clause. Now, once we know that something is an independent clause, that's really the end of the line because it just means it's a sentence. But let's look at the next example here. If he hadn't heard the kitten mewing, okay, we have a subject, he, we actually have a verb phrase, we have a helping verb had, and an action verb heard. So we might go, this is a sentence. Well, let's check our criteria. It does have a subject and verb. So we already can tell it is not a phrase, it is a clause. But it doesn't finish the story. It doesn't finish the thought. We're missing essential information here. If he hadn't heard the kitten mewing, well, what happened? It leaves us wanting to know more. What would have happened to the kitten? Was the kitten left out in the rain? We don't know. So that would be what we would call a dependent clause. So the first thing we're going to practice is telling if a group of words is a phrase or clause. Then we're going to go to the next step and decide whether it is an independent or dependent clause. So let's start with phrases versus clauses. So I have some examples here for you. Let's look at the first one. Behind the dusty wardrobe. Well, we do have a noun here, but also you probably recognize this word behind from our list of prepositions on page 102 in the book. This would be just a prepositional phrase. There is no verb. So that is not a clause. Let's look at the next one. Lucy opened the door. Lucy is a subject. She's doing the action, and the action she's doing is opening the door. That counts as a clause. And in fact, that would be an independent clause. It could stand alone. It's a complete sentence. Let's look at the next one. Leaping and bounding. Now, you might be tempted. You might see these ing words and go, ooh, verbs, progressive verbs. But remember, any ing word without a helping verb is not a verb. So these might be present participles. They might be gerunds. They're not verbs. So it doesn't meet that criteria for a clause. And there's definitely no subject. So this would be a phrase. Let's look at the next one. Whether they won or lost. They is a pronoun, and it is doing an action of winning or losing. So this would be a clause. Now, it doesn't stand alone. It is dependent, but it would still be a clause. Next one, he picked up the pieces. He, subject, picked, verb. Going to add a period because that is not just a clause. It's actually a complete thought. And then the last one, that milk is from Uncle Louie's cow. Milk is. Now, I chose this one to show you, you don't have to have an action verb. This is just a state of being verb. Milk is. In some sentences, it might act as a helping verb, or it might act as a linking verb. So it doesn't have to be an action verb to count as a verb. If you have any verb, it counts as a verb. So that would be a clause. So this is the kind of lesson I would give to teach the difference between phrases and clauses. And then I would have my students do an exercise, something like this, which is from our workbook. And I would put names on the board and students would volunteer. And then I would see if they were understanding the concept. Then we would go to the next step of independent versus dependent clauses. And I would give them some practice on that. So I would show them some examples like this. And we would say that a dependent clause, think about this word dependent. If you are dependent upon someone else, that means you need someone else. You cannot do something by yourself. You depend upon someone else's help. A dependent clause is exactly that. It depends upon you adding something else to it in order for it to be a complete thought. So if you look at the first one, I ate too many pickles, subject verb clause. But can it stand alone? Yeah, it's a complete thought. So that would be independent. Whereas the second one, when I danced, well, it has a subject and verb, so I know it's a clause. But what happened when I danced? Did I feel happy? Did I fall down? I don't know. So I need to add something to it in order for it to be a complete thought, so it would be dependent. So then I would go through the rest of these examples, and then I would have my students do a practice on something like this. And then I like to, in my classes, explain things in different ways because sometimes we don't understand something the first time or we need to explain it in a new way. So one thing I like to do with my students when we are learning about clauses is we like to fill out a flow chart together. So This is something I do in my Grammar 3 class when we're first learning about clauses. And it helps us know which questions to ask to determine not only if something is a clause, but what type of clause it is. So we would say, is this a group of words? Well, if the answer is yes, we're going to go to this box. Does it have a subject and verb? If the answer is no, then we know it's a phrase. Now, if we were focusing on phrases at this point, we could ask some other questions and talk about different types of phrases. But we're not going that direction. We're focusing on clauses. So if the answer is yes, it does have a subject and verb, then we know it's a clause. Then we ask the next question, which is, can it stand alone? If the answer is yes, independent clause, and like we said, that's the end of the line. It's just a sentence. If, however, it cannot stand alone, then it would be a dependent clause. And then we learn from there how to determine which type of dependent clause it is, whether it is an adjective, adverb, or noun clause. And in our study of clauses, we also do a lot of diagramming. We learn how to diagram all the different types of clauses. And then one of the most practical things we do with clauses is we learn which clauses require commas around them, before them, after them, and which do not. Because I find that students tend to guess at whether a clause needs commas or not. So once we get to the end of our unit on clauses and learn how to identify a clause and a dependent clause, then we learn how to identify which clauses need commas and which don't. So that is just a little sample of a lesson. It would be a much longer lesson. I teach for each class lasts about an hour. And again, we do a lot of interactive work in my classes. Practice on the board, we play games, we have a lot of fun. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope you'll join us in one of our grammar classes. Thank you.